I think that there is a tinge of that, not a tinge, more than a tinge of that ideology in the way that people are reconceiving of the notion of caste, particularly like the Black intellectual elite, because you have, growing up as a Black person in America, you do have some individual influence over the way that you're perceived if you can signal class, cultural class, right? Signal your way out of the kind of racialized affect that you'll get from other people, right? So you can signal your way out of certain types of racist behaviors. If you go to the doctor and you dress up and you look wealthier, you can kind of signal your way out of mistreatment. You can signal your way into being taken more seriously in a job interview, et cetera, et cetera. There is something true interpersonally in certain kinds of respectability politics. And so that, I think, makes people extrapolate from their personal experience that the worst thing about race is that it can declass them once they've actually become rich. So you get all of these anecdotes like, Oprah went into a Louis Vuitton and she got followed around by a security guard, and there are anecdotes like that in the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, I think is her name.
Right.
As though like the thing that shows you how evil racism is that it can endure when you have earned your way out of Blackness as a class position, because there's a conflation of being poor and being Black that a lot of people, Black people, are told to fight their way out of it. And that's true of many different immigrant groups, but it's particularly strong and pronounced in certain types of Black politics. And I think that it is part of the kind of ideological bent of erasing class as an issue and remaking Black issues as the issues of the Black elite. It's part of trying to have that distance and say, no, we're not that kind of Black person. We're the deserving kind. We should be given access because we earned it. It really doesn't it's like what you were saying about your student. It doesn't fundamentally argue against these deeply entrenched ideas about who is poor and why they're poor. It just says don't make this assumption about this set of people, or don't or remove structures that would keep this set of people, in a lower class position.
Well, I'll tell you about that though. I mean, that goes pretty far back. I mean, that's part of Homer Adolph Plessy's brief in his lawsuit, right? I mean, that that's a Louisiana separate car law.
Yeah.
You didn't make class distinctions among Blacks, and that was a standard part of Black arguments against the imposition of Jim Crow at the end of the 19th century. It was also all over Charles Chestnut's fiction, right? And Anna Julia Cooper, who I guess I'm supposed to do like this when I mentioned, because she's supposed to be a founder of Black feminism, but was very clearly, right, class skewed in her. Well, they all were, because it's a class phenomenon. And what Touré mentioned, Du Bois in the 1890s, he was the same deal, right? I mean, there were, and argued this actually in the Philadelphia Negro, that part of the problem with race relations was that the only Black people whom respectable white people ever came in contact with were the menials and the coons, basically.
Yeah, not the talented 10th that
right. So I mean, that's been part of the class program all the way through. And sometimes it gets really pathological, like people like Shelby Steele, who had his 15 minutes in the 90s. It was, but also like a bunch of Yale and other, Ivy League undergraduates in the Obama cohort, right, roughly speaking, lamented that, all of a sudden, the ghetto rap style was supposed to be what's authentically Black, or what's happened to us. We've done all the right stuff and nobody. So why can't we be authentically Black? But then by the time Spike Lee was inflicted upon us, right, you also saw though that the class had found a way to kind of split the difference, so that they'd constructed their own notion of of authentic blackness that depended on a caricature of the old black bourgeoisie against whom this character was deployed, right? So, the old black bourgeoisie who put on airs and liked classical music was one problem, but then this ghetto girl over here was the other problem, right? But yeah, it's been around for a while, but it's definitely a trope, shall we say?
Well, and just to amplify this point, that in for someone like W.B. Du Bois, and of course, as I would have alluded to previously, the Urban League, that for them, the part of the problem with racism was the failure to make the class distinctions among blacks, right? I mean, just to put it succinctly. And oddly, I mean, this is what I find a little strange about Wilkerson's argument, is that oddly that announces, I would argue, not caste, but the fact that race is a shorthand for class standing. I mean, this is a class society. The point of race, on some level, its invention, as the Fields sisters have argued, and as I heard Barbara Fields argue 2 days a week when I TA'd for her back in the mid to late 1990s, the invention of race was essentially came down to explaining why black people were exceptions to liberalism, right? Why slaves and the masses of black people were exceptions to American liberalism. And what that means practically is why blacks are, permanently at the bottom in a society that's an anti-caste society, but as a class society, right? And what and race is the vehicle for doing so, right? The presumed biological distinctiveness, if you will, of so-called racial groups, as I've said to my students over the years, is a way to justify, or had been, a way to justify exploiting blacks permanently and forever, right? And a version of the same thing with American Indians. And of course, it's gotten much more complicated over the last couple centuries or more at this point, and even more complicated, especially complicated in the last 50 to 70 years. But that's where that shorthand comes into play, right?
But it seems like, that points to a need to understand political economy rather than a need to erase it, right? If you're saying that this category is, and I do think that you're right, that in Wilkerson's book, she's kind of, gesturing at that, but it seems like more of the issue is that you can be a wealthy black person that's declassed by your blackness. Not that you can be declassed at all, or not that the class stratifications are so intense that, they're consigning millions of people to misery and death. You know what I mean? It's like a little bit, it's like.
And there's the flip side, that your class standing at the very least mitigates the race, right? The problems of racism. And, I won't bore anybody with any personal anecdotes about that any more than my father would likely bore anybody with any personal anecdotes about that. But I think most middle and upper class blacks, if they reflected on the realities of their life experiences, would have to confront the fact that their class standing ultimately, often enough, not in every single instance, but mitigates racism, to varying degrees, and certainly changes the kinds of issues that are important to them, right? Whether or not it's, let's say, affirmative action versus welfare reform is an expression of one's class standing. So the other thing, though, that's kind of interesting about this point, Ariella, that you had raised about class as a way to diminish racism's like presentation, that was post-racialism, right? I mean, and that was, of course, one of the things that was infuriating about Obama's post-racialism, which I don't know if it's fair to say was an anachronism. I mean, I guess it was more atavistic than anything else, right? Because it was an expression of a long-standing view. But in its most recent form, post-racialism was just a very minor update to role modeling ideology, which is bound up, of course, with underclass ideology, so that for all intent and purpose, part of the appeal of the post-racial framework that Obama was selling, and that I think many blacks embraced to varying degrees. I don't know anyone who embraced post-racialism, the moniker, but you can embrace the substance of something while formally rejecting the title. And I think a lot of Black people embraced the substance, or at least elements of the substance of post-racialism, while simultaneously rejecting the moniker. But a big chunk of it, as I was reminded of every Black History Month, every MLK dinner that I attended, or Black History Month talk that I went to between 2008 and 2012, if not 2008 and 2015, was some version of if you believe it, you can achieve it, right? I mean, that you can overcome your circumstances by acting right and taking school seriously, of course, right? Turning off the TV and reading a book and taking advantage of the opportunities that are before you, which everyone has to do, but that doesn't make it a panacea, right? I mean, you don't have a choice but to make the most of the opportunities that are before you. But we don't actually all read from the same menu of choices, right? And so some of us who are the children of PhDs, let's say, and raised by relatively well-educated and prosperous professionals, either in Indonesia or Southwest Atlanta, Georgia, have more options before them, right? Than some of us who grow up in Elmhaven apartment projects or Techwood homes in New Haven or Atlanta, Georgia, right? Because in option A, you've kind of won the parent lottery, even if there's racism. And that means even if there's racism, you have more choices before you if your parents are relatively prosperous, or if you yourself are relatively prosperous. You might be able to actually afford tuition, let's say, or have a job with healthcare, with health insurance, and not have to worry about turning the lights on, or have the ability to pay for a tutor in school that, if you're disadvantaged economically, these things are not on the table. And of course, you may have the opportunity to smoke the reefer. Who says that anyway? I mean, like, reefer. Really, I should have done the Obama when I said that and pushed my ear out. But anyway, I prefer to call it weed. Thank you very much. But you can smoke the reefer or weed, and it's no big deal, right? Because you're doing it in your in the dorm room, let's say, in your selective liberal arts college, where everybody gets to smoke weed and nobody calls campus security because the class creaming there. You do that at a public university, though, as I've learned from students at the public university that I work at, the security officers are real police, right? They're state troopers, essentially, and you're going to get busted for real. So depending on how much tuition money you pay to go to college, even, there's a difference in experience that you can have in the dorm rooms, despite the realness of racism.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.